In the frozen winter of 1869, just beyond the outskirts of Lawrence, Kansas, there stood a brick structure that promised salvation to the most vulnerable, yet harbored a truth darker than the prairie nights that surrounded it. It was called the Orphan Asylum of Mercy, and to families broken by the Civil War, it seemed a divine answer. Widows brought their starving children, wounded men sent the sons they could no longer raise, and desperate settlers whispered prayers of gratitude when they saw its wooden cross rising against the horizon. Yet what history has since uncovered reveals that behind those consecrated walls, mercy was not practiced, but methodically extinguished. When the building was finally torn down decades later, workers uncovered a hidden basement, sealed beneath thick stone. Inside were rows of iron restraints, crude surgical instruments, and the skeletal remains of 47 children carefully arranged in groups, their bones still marked by rusted chains. Alongside them lay 3 leather-bound journals written in meticulous clerical handwriting. The entries catalogued not names but numbers, reducing children to subjects whose breath, pulse, and suffering were measured until silence fell. One note recorded a heartbeat that ended at precisely 3:17 a.m. Another tallied the days of starvation before collapse. Each line blurred scripture with cruelty, transforming death into an experiment sanctified by prayer. For more than a century, state officials suppressed these discoveries. Newspapers that attempted to publish details were forced to retract their stories within days. Surviving families who claimed their children had vanished within the asylum's walls were silenced, their testimonies dismissed as grief-stricken fantasies. Only fragments of the journals, smuggled into private collections, preserved the evidence of what happened. These scraps reveal that between 1866 and 1869, the Orphan Asylum of Mercy was not a refuge, but a laboratory of suffering and institution where innocence was measured, recorded, and destroyed with methodical devotion. What you are about to hear is drawn from those suppressed reports and forgotten letters, pieced together from the ashes of archives meant to remain sealed. This is not the story of compassion, but of how mercy itself was weaponized, and how an institution built for protection became a machine of quiet annihilation. Before we move deeper into this story, I need to pause. The truths hidden within the Orphan Asylum of Mercy are not easy to face, and this channel is not for everyone. It exists for those willing to confront the most unsettling shadows of American history, the stories polite society tried to bury. If you count yourself among the few brave enough to listen, then join us. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and add your voice in the comments by telling me where you are watching from. Each state, each city becomes a reminder that these children are not forgotten, that their suffering is still witnessed more than a century later. Your support allows these silenced voices to be heard again and ensures that what happened behind those brick walls will never be hidden in darkness again. In the years immediately following the Civil War, Kansas existed in a strange tension between rebuilding and ruin. Lawrence, still scarred by Quantrill's infamous raid only a few years earlier, bore visible reminders of violence. Burned-out foundations lingered at the edges of town, while widows and orphans filled the streets and wounded men haunted porches with hollow eyes. Families who had once been prosperous farmers or merchants now struggled to plant crops, repair wagons, or even feed themselves. The social fabric had been torn, and institutions promising relief appeared as lifelines amid the devastation. It was into this landscape that the Orphan Asylum of Mercy emerged in 1866, presented as a sanctuary for the children of Kansas who had been left abandoned, sick, or starving. The asylum stood just beyond the town's boundaries, perched where farmland met open prairie. Its structure, built from brick and timber, donated by benefactors and parishioners, looked unassuming but sturdy, A wooden cross crowned its roofline, visible from the road that led travelers in and out of Lawrence. To those who saw it from a distance, the building appeared almost pastoral, its modest chapel attached to long dormitory wings. A few locals remarked, however, that the place seemed too quiet, as if the laughter of children was absent, even when dozens supposedly lived inside. The grounds were tidy, the windows polished, yet there was a sterility that unsettled those who lingered too long near the fence line. Inside, order dominated. Rows of narrow cots filled the dormitories, each bed covered with plain wool blankets, each trunk at the foot of the bed marked only by a number. The chapel, situated at the heart of the building, was dominated by a large wooden crucifix, its shadow stretching over rows of pews, where children sat in silence during extended hours of prayer. Meals were sparse and consumed without chatter. Silence was enforced as a sign of discipline. The sisters spoke often of humility and obedience, praising stillness as a virtue. For visitors, this gave an impression of remarkable order, but for those who watched closely, it carried a tone less of devotion and more of suppression. The asylum's location was no accident. By placing it on the edge of town, the administrators could maintain isolation while still projecting an image of accessibility. It was close enough that townspeople could donate food, clothing, or money, but far enough that few could casually witness the daily routines. Families delivering children into its care described the experience as both heartbreaking and reassuring. Heartbreaking because they were surrendering sons or daughters, reassuring because they believed those children would be cared for by devout and charitable hands. Donations were frequently acknowledged in church bulletins, giving the institution an aura of transparency, even as questions about the children's daily lives went unanswered. The leadership of the asylum solidified its reputation. Sister Constance, the matron, became known for her pale countenance and gentle smile. Her reputation as the mother of orphans spread quickly through Lawrence. She spoke softly in public, always invoking mercy and sacrifice, and her presence soothed anxious parents who had no other options for their children. At her side was Father Muldoon, a priest whose sermons carried a stern intensity. He spoke of suffering as purification, of discipline as salvation. Many found comfort in his confidence, though others noted that his words seemed less about compassion than about endurance. Together, the two presented an image of benevolent guardianship, convincing donors and parishioners alike that the asylum was a noble enterprise. By 1867, more than 40 children lived within the walls of the asylum. They came from across the state, orphans of Union and Confederate soldiers alike, children abandoned by mothers who could no longer feed them, sons and daughters of immigrants who perished in epidemics. Their ages ranged widely, from infants cared for in a small nursery to teenagers who assisted in tending the younger children. Yet despite the numbers, few outside the asylum ever saw them. Outings into town were rare and carefully managed. When children were escorted to church or errands, they walked in rigid lines, heads bowed, eyes lowered. Neighbors remarked that they looked more like soldiers under drill than like children enjoying a reprieve. Those who entered the building described a sense of sterility and weight. A farmer's wife who volunteered briefly in the kitchen later told friends that the air felt like a tomb. She noted that the children obeyed instantly, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. She never returned after her first day, though she never spoke of her reasons publicly. Another visitor recalled seeing identical marks on the wrists of several boys, thin lines like burns or abrasions, but when he mentioned them, Sister Constance dismissed them as minor injuries from farm chores. Such explanations were accepted without challenge, because few wished to accuse a charitable institution of wrongdoing. In those first years, the asylum secured its reputation as a symbol of order amid chaos. Donors praised its discipline, clergy upheld its sanctity, and townspeople grudgingly admired its efficiency. Yet beneath that surface, unease persisted. Some sensed that the silence of the children was too absolute, that the routines were more like rituals of control than acts of care. And in the locked basement, whose shuttered windows never admitted light, a darker purpose awaited its time to be revealed. At the center of the Orphan Asylum of Mercy were the figures whose presence defined both its public image and its hidden reality. Chief among them was Sister Constance, a woman of delicate frame and soft voice who had arrived in Lawrence with little documented history. Parish records noted her as a widow of uncertain origin, though she spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Her pale complexion and constant air of serenity made her appear almost angelic to those who met her. She was praised for her tireless devotion to the children, often referred to as the Mother of the Lost. Yet those who observed closely remarked that her composure never faltered, even in moments of grief or crisis. Her smile seemed fixed, her tone unchanging, as if carefully rehearsed. To donors and parishioners, this made her an emblem of saintly endurance. To skeptics, it suggested something colder. Father Muldoon stood in stark contrast, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that bore into his congregation. He embodied authority rather than comfort. His sermons, delivered with fiery conviction, spoke often of sacrifice, suffering, and the purifying nature of hardship. Parishioners described leaving his services with a mix of fear and admiration. He warned that sin was purged only through endurance, that children trained in discipline would grow closest to God. This rhetoric appealed to a population still reeling from war, who saw pain as inevitable and purification as necessary. Yet it also provided a chilling rationale for cruelty, cloaking severity in the language of sanctity. Muldoon became the institution's shield, his presence deterring questions and silencing doubts. Working beside them was a small cadre of nuns, each of whom presented the same outward appearance of devotion and service. They were rarely seen outside the asylum's walls, and when they did appear, their movements were measured, their words clipped, their eyes lowered. They offered no personal histories, only identities defined by service to God and obedience to Sister Constance. They supervised meals, enforced silence, and led prayers with a discipline that left little room for childhood spontaneity. While some townsfolk admired their efficiency, others quietly noted that the children under their care seemed more subdued than nurtured, as though their personalities were being pressed into uniform molds. Another figure tied closely to the asylum was Dr. Joseph Harding, a young physician whose practice extended into the community. He had first been invited to treat minor illnesses among the children, but quickly became unsettled by what he witnessed. He noted the unusual uniformity of their symptoms: pale skin, listless eyes, scars on wrists and ankles that did not match the explanations given. Harding began keeping private notes, recording his suspicion that something systematic was at work. Yet his protests carried little weight against the asylum's carefully cultivated reputation. Over time, he found himself summoned less often, his access restricted. To some, Harding's concerns seemed like the jealous warnings of an outsider. To history, they would later read as a prophet's ignored alarm. The children themselves formed the largest and most silent part of the asylum's portrait. To visitors, they appeared obedient to a fault. They moved in rigid lines, bowed their heads in prayer, and never raised their voices in laughter or protest. Each child was assigned a number as well as a name, a practice explained as necessary for keeping orderly records in the crowded dormitories. The numbers appeared on trunks, clothing, and in ledgers that tracked their daily routines. While this system impressed donors with its efficiency, it erased individuality. Children became interchangeable. defined less by who they were than by how they fit into the institution's structure. Among these children, occasional anomalies drew attention. A boy who stared too long, his eyes unblinking. A girl whose arms bore patterned bruises explained away as discipline for disobedience. An infant who vanished from the nursery without notice, remembered only as transferred to another family, though no adoption record existed. These incidents, isolated and undocumented, were dismissed by townsfolk as misunderstandings or exaggerations. Yet taken together, they hinted at a pattern, a system that transformed living children into subjects of observation, recorded and erased as quietly as one might erase a ledger line. The architecture of the asylum reinforced this impression. Visitors were shown the chapel and dormitories, but never the basement. Its shuttered windows admitted no light, and its doors were secured with iron locks. Sister Constance explained that it housed provisions, tools, and records too sensitive to be disturbed by children. No volunteer or visitor ever entered. Only the sisters and Father Muldoon possessed keys, and they moved through its doors with practiced ease. The secrecy was justified as practicality, yet the very existence of such hidden chambers suggested another layer of purpose beneath the surface. By the close of 1867, the Asylum of Mercy stood as both sanctuary and enigma. Publicly, it was praised as a model of Christian charity, a bulwark of discipline amid chaos. Privately, it radiated unease, its leaders too composed, its children too silent, its secrets too carefully locked away. The community, weary from war and desperate for stability, chose to accept its appearance rather than question its reality. But beneath the veneer of sanctity, something far darker was already preparing to reveal itself. The first undeniable fracture in the facade of the Orphan Asylum of Mercy came in the early months of 1867, when the disappearance of a child outside its walls unsettled the fragile trust of the Lawrence community. Her name was Sarah Dempsey, a farmer's daughter of only 9 years. She was not a ward of the asylum, nor had her family ever intended to place her there. Yet witnesses last recalled seeing her near the gates of the asylum on a winter afternoon, clutching a small basket of bread she had been sent to deliver to a neighbor. By nightfall, she was gone. Her mother insisted she had never returned home, while the sisters of the asylum claimed firmly that Sarah had never entered the grounds. No inquiry followed beyond a perfunctory search of the fields, and the incident was attributed to river accidents or abduction along the road. But for families already uneasy about the silence surrounding the asylum, the vanishing of a local child became the first public crack in its reputation. The unease deepened when, over the next months, several children inside the asylum were reported dead. Official records attributed the losses to common ailments: consumption, fever, weakness of the lungs. These causes were accepted at face value by a weary community accustomed to disease, but troubling inconsistencies emerged. Bodies were not returned to families. Funerals were conducted without viewings. Coffins were small, sealed, and carried away in wagons at night, their destinations unclear. Relatives who asked to see the remains were told it was unwise disease had disfigured the children, and memory would be kinder than reality. Though families grieved, they had little choice but to accept the explanations. Dr. Harding grew more vocal in his suspicions during this period. Summoned for an examination in March, he noted strange uniformity among symptoms. Children presented not with the ragged breathing of tuberculosis, but with skin mottling, strange bruises, and signs of dehydration. He observed scars on wrists and ankles that suggested restraint, though Sister Constance assured him they were marks of childish mischief, from climbing rafters or tugging at ropes. Harding left unconvinced. In his private journal he wrote, "The pattern is too consistent. They fall ill not in scattered fashion, but in ordered succession as though selected. The injuries are too alike to be accidents. It was the last time he was invited to examine children within the asylum. Neighbors began to whisper of unusual activity around the grounds at night. Wagons were seen departing long after midnight, their loads hidden beneath tarps, accompanied not by mourning families but by silent sisters. One farmer swore he saw a shallow pit freshly dug on his land, filled again by mourning, its soil stamped flat by many feet. Another described finding scraps of cloth in the creek behind the asylum, fabric clearly cut from children's garments. None of these accounts were spoken aloud in public meetings. Fear of the church's authority and dread of confronting unspeakable possibilities kept the whispers contained to kitchens and fence lines. The most haunting testimony came from a boy named Peter, briefly placed in the asylum when his widowed mother fell ill. She recovered sooner than expected and reclaimed him after only 3 weeks. In that short time, the boy's demeanor had transformed. Once lively, he returned withdrawn, speaking in whispers. When pressed, he told his mother that he and other children were taken at night to the basement, where they were ordered to sit in silence while sisters timed how long they could remain motionless. Sometimes, he said, they were forced to hold their arms aloft until exhaustion, while someone recorded the minutes before they collapsed. He described the sound of chains dragging across stone and voices counting in the dark. His mother dismissed his words as nightmares born of grief, but she never forgot the tremor in his voice when he insisted they were listening for our hearts. By late summer, the pattern could no longer be ignored by those closest to the asylum. The number of dead mounted, each with the same bland cause inscribed in records, each removed quickly and quietly. The children who remained appeared thinner, paler, with dark rings around their eyes. They no longer spoke, even in whispers. Silence hung not only in the chapel but in the yard, in the dormitories, in the very air around the building. For outsiders, the asylum still carried the aura of sanctity, upheld by Father Muldoon's sermons about suffering and purification. For those who watched more closely, however, it had become something else, a house where children disappeared not only in body but in spirit, where grief was ritualized and silence weaponized. The first incident, then, was not just the vanishing of Sarah Dempsey, or the unclaimed bodies, or the marks on young wrists. It was the dawning recognition that what appeared to be a sanctuary might instead be a machine of suffering. It was the moment when unease shifted into dread, when questions could no longer be dismissed as idle gossip. The facade of mercy had cracked, and beneath it lay glimpses of something calculated, hidden in plain sight, waiting to reveal its full extent. By the turn of 1868, the asylum's rhythm had settled into something that resembled order only from a distance. Inside, the routines hardened. Wake before dawn, prayer without voice, breakfast measured, not served. Children marched between dormitory, chapel, and yard in lines so exact that neighbors began to time them by the clock on the courthouse. The discipline impressed benefactors, but those who worked nearby noticed a different kind of precision. The same children missing from roll call on the same weekday each month. The same shutters latched on the same nights. The same lanterns burning late behind the chapel windows when storms drove everyone else indoors. Deaths continued, reported in ledgers with a sameness that felt intentional. Each entry carried a number, a brief cause, and a date, never a narrative, never a witness. The spacing between losses grew almost mathematical, with new names added at intervals that raised the hair on the neck of anyone who compared pages. A seamstress who mended the sisters' aprons found rusty stains that never washed out and stopped taking their work. A baker who delivered loaves at sunrise said he never heard children in the yard, only an occasional low chant, like counting carried on the wind. Dr. Harding, shut out from the wards, turned to patterns he could observe from without. He copied burial notices, spoke quietly with gravediggers, and traced the routes of the midnight wagons by the ruts they left in soft ground. What emerged on paper did not look like illness passing through a dormitory. It looked like a timetable. He marked dates when shipments of lamp oil and iron fittings arrived, amounts far beyond what a small institution might need, and aligned them with the deaths that followed. In his journal, he wrote that the asylum behaved less like a home and more like an apparatus, one geared to convert breath and heartbeat into columns of data. Skeptics in town still dismissed such talk as grief running ahead of facts. The war had made everyone see ghosts. Children died of poverty every week. The sisters were strict because the world beyond their fence was cruel. Yet even the complacent faltered when 3 siblings admitted in June were reported dead by October, each exactly 6 weeks apart, each dismissed as frailty. Their aunt asked to see the bodies and was refused on grounds of contagion. She left the rectory carrying only a certificate and a tremor in her hands that never fully ceased. Around this time, farmhands working the low fields behind the asylum noticed runoff pooling near the foundation after heavy rain. In the pools lay fragments that did not belong to soil, bits of cloth stitched for small shoulders, a tin tag stamped with a number, a sliver of bone too delicate to be from livestock. The men said nothing to the priest. They carried the fragments to a shed and burned them, then told their wives they had seen nothing. Silence in Douglas County that year was both habit and shield. Children who left the asylum for short periods returned to relatives after a parent recovered or an adoption fell through, displayed the same dull calm Harding had described months earlier. They ate slowly, counted almost unconsciously, and startled when clocks chimed. One boy kept raising his arms and holding them above his head until his muscles shook, then lowered them and began again, watching an imagined timer no one else could see. Another would stand in a corner and control his breathing, eyes fixed on the wall as if waiting for an order that no longer came. Their families called it discipline. Harding called it conditioning. Father Muldoon's sermons turned sterner, as if preparing the congregation to accept whatever news might follow. He spoke of the soul refined by pain, of children who met hardship without complaint as examples to the living. He praised obedience and denounced curiosity, warning that prying into holy work invited temptation. Parishioners left the church uneasy and tried not to name what troubled them. The priest's language supplied a script for endurance while stripping away the right to question. Merchants' ledgers added their own quiet testimony. Receipts recorded purchases of heavy chain, padlocks, tinctures, and laudanum in quantities that made little sense for a house of prayer. When asked, Sister Constance explained the chain as necessary for securing cellars against theft, the locks for safeguarding provisions, the laudanum for calming fevers. The answers were tidy, plausible, and unprovable. Donors accepted them because the alternative was to admit that their charity was buying instruments of restraint. By late autumn, the sisters began a practice neighbors called the stillness. On those nights, no candle showed at dormitory windows. No hymn rose from the chapel. Only the faintest murmur drifted from below ground, as if many small lungs were being taught to hold air at once. A mill hand swore that passing after midnight, he heard numbers recited in a cadence too exact to be prayer. He told no one but his wife, and she made him promise never to repeat it. The sheriff, who had long dismissed complaints as exaggeration, finally visited the grounds after a storm undermined part of the rear wall. He saw nothing conclusive, only disturbed earth, hastily tamped. But the emptiness itself unsettled him. He asked to tour the basement and was informed the key had been misplaced. He asked again a week later and was told the floor had flooded and records were being dried. On his third attempt, the doors stood open but revealed only stacked crates and a smell of oil that stung the eyes. He wrote in his report that nothing appeared amiss, then added a private line in the margin: "Nothing appears." Thus the year advanced, and with it the sense that the asylum had crossed an invisible threshold. What began as whispers congealed into a shape that ordinary life could no longer dissolve. The town still nodded to the sisters on market days, still sent coins in envelopes, still bowed heads when the priest lifted his hands. But beneath the gestures lay a knowledge that had not yet found words, the understanding that something systematic was underway behind those brick walls, something that treated children as intervals to be measured, silence as a substance to be weighed, and death as a conclusion reached by design. The escalation had begun, and it did not slow. By the time the thaw set in, rumor had a body. The searchers began where the stories converged: the creek bend, the smokehouse foundation, the sunken line of old stone that everyone called the convent wall, though no nun had set foot there in years. Frost left the ground yielding but tight, and spades lifted out earth in heavy slabs that kept the shape of the blade. The first find was not bones, but iron, a ring with hammered tails and a practiced blacksmith's signature in the peening marks. It matched the faint circles cut into the root-cellar flagstones, the ones every farmhand had dismissed as old barrel hoops. Someone had installed restraint into the architecture. Once soil gave up its first secret, the rest followed with brutal obedience. Buttons without thread, a hair ribbon seamed with lime, milk teeth in a length of ash where no child would have gone willingly. Every discovery had the smallness of a life interrupted and the calculation of hands that meant to leave nothing of value to chance. The town physician, called to stand official witness, stopped writing symptoms and began drawing plans. Elevation of the cellar rooms, cross-sections of plaster with embedded grit, diagrams of wooden braces drilled for bolts. No one admitted owning. His notes accumulated into an anatomy of intention. The charitable facade also began to slough away. In the ledger hidden behind the herb chest, an account book that had once listed purchases of flour and tallow. The columns changed midway to other currencies, initials in place of names, ages in the margin, small marks denoting quiet or stubborn. Interleaved with the arithmetic were pressed plant samples labeled in a neat schoolroom hand: foxglove, belladonna, oil of bitter almond. Bottles recovered from the wash-basin cupboard smelled faintly of almonds even after rinsing, the sweet ghost that clings to arsenical tinctures. The physician cut a strip from the bottom of one cork and watched it fizz when touched with copper filings. He did not have to write the word poison to make his meaning clear. What had been hearsay about midnight activity became trackable patterns. In each place where an animal pit had been filled to keep foxes out, the fill soil layered wrong fresh loam over older clay, lime dust in a place that never held masonry. The skeptical farmer who once told neighbors to stop frightening their wives followed a line of cinder flecks along the ridge and found a burn trench carefully fed with short lengths of bone. The lengths were uniformly broken, not by scavengers but by design to fit the trench's width, a geometry of disposal. The doctor's journal entries changed tense. Where he had written claims, he now wrote observes. He recorded bruising in discrete rings around ankles and wrists when the ground offered up articulated remains. He sketched healed fractures that spoke of old punishments on those who had survived long enough to repair. Beneath the sketches, he tallied numbers and dates, and, in a small, horrified aside, the time intervals that matched the ledger's increments. The Book of Remedies and the Book of Accounts measured the same lives from different ends. The minister who had insisted on Christian patience stopped preaching certainty when the boys cleared the choir loft and pulled down a crate of hymnals sawn hollow. Inside were letters never sent, careful, hopeful lines explaining that a child had been placed for a season until a cousin could fetch them. The names at the bottoms matched initials in the ledger. The paper was foxed, dimpled by damp, sealed and resealed in the same wax envelopes addressed, never posted. Outreach had been staged as theater, correspondence as prop. Even sound began to testify. When the eastern wall of the cellar was struck with a mallet, the stone returned a dull answer everywhere except one course. There the note rose and rolled, as if it had a throat. Behind that course, when pried free, lay a long cavity packed with ash, wire, and bits of fabric pressed into snakes by heat. The wire matched the gauge of the restraint rings. A strip of scorched ticking still held the faint pattern of child-sized mattress ticking. The cavity had been both oven and archive. A second ledger turned up under floorboards in the parlor, a smaller book with identical hand but different purpose. It listed not supplies but visitors, dates, weather, what sermon was offered to which denomination, which verses elicited tears. Marginal notes recorded which phrases produced quicker compliance. Pity was recorded in the same line as profit. The physician recopied whole pages into his journal with a rigid pen that scratched as if it disliked the task. The skeptical sheriff, practical, measured, aligned by habit, with evidence rather than emotion, stopped measuring distance and began measuring routine. He built a map from 100 fragments, delivery routes altered by half an hour on the same days, smoke from a chimney that should have been cold in summer, a pattern of darkness in windows that suggested more inhabitants than had ever been admitted. When he overlaid the physician's chronology, the schedules meshed with a kind of perverse elegance. Workdays lengthened exactly when a new initial appeared in the ledger. Prayer meetings convened exactly at the times recorded as agitated. With each piece, the town's vocabulary shifted. The word misfortune started to sound like a lie people tell themselves to stay upright. Faces took on the look of people who have rehearsed for a smaller grief and been handed a larger one. The schoolhouse boards, once a place for quilting schedules and seed exchanges, held lists of questions no one had thought to ask before. Who saw which child last? Who noted the smell of lye in summer? Who remembered the extra cords of wood ordered in a year when everyone else went without? Memory, once polite, shed its manners. The physician's final entry for the season dispensed with neutrality. He wrote that silence was not ignorance but design, that the architecture of the place and the arithmetic of the ledgers proved premeditation beyond pastoral euphemism. He catalogued the tools, recovered a set of short hacksaws, a brace bit bored through with the same diameter as the iron rings, a mallet with faint crescents cut into its face from striking chain. He closed the night with a line that did not sound like a doctor at all. The walls here know how to keep secrets. We will have to teach them how to speak. By then, the town no longer argued about whether darkness had visited. It lived with the fact that darkness had chosen the hill as an address and filed paperwork in tidy hand. The last rumor turned into the last spadeful of proof when the thaw widened a sink near the ash grove, and the ground let go of a bundle wrapped in sailcloth, weighted with a clock gear. The gear was stamped with a maker's mark from a city 2 states east. Someone far away had once set that clock for a morning that never came. Now the town understood that the schedule had been kept, just not the one anyone had imagined. Before we uncover what was truly hidden beneath those locked cellar doors, I need to pause. If the escalating dread of this story has already left your skin crawling, then share this video with a friend who thinks they can handle it. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and tell me in the comments which state or city you're listening from. These forgotten horrors didn't unfold in distant lands, they happened here, in towns and villages much like your own. Your support ensures that the voices long buried are finally heard, and that their stories are never again consigned to silence. By the spring of 1869, the walls of secrecy surrounding the Orphan Asylum of Mercy were already weakened by rumor, suspicion, and the fragments of evidence neighbors could no longer ignore. But what finally tore away the last veil was not gossip or suspicion, it was fire. On a warm night in April, flames leapt from the upper dormitory, visible across the prairie like a beacon. The alarm spread through Lawrence, and townsfolk poured onto the road with buckets, barrels, and horse-drawn carts of water. They came intending to rescue children, but what they uncovered instead burned into their memories more indelibly than the blaze itself. The asylum's front doors, usually sealed, had been left open in the confusion. Men stormed through the chapel and dormitories calling for survivors. The air was thick with smoke, but curiously, there were fewer children than expected. Dozens had been recorded in the rolls, yet only a handful stumbled from the halls, coughing and dazed. Their silence struck the rescuers as uncanny. They did not cry or scream, but moved as though they were waiting for direction that never came. When part of the roof collapsed, townsfolk rushed toward the basement, convinced more children had sought refuge below. It was then that the first hidden door was discovered, a reinforced entry concealed behind stacked crates. The sheriff and two farmers forced it open with axes, expecting to find a storeroom. Instead, their lanterns illuminated a long corridor of stone, lined with doors that opened onto chambers never mentioned in parish records. Inside those chambers lay the evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty. Chains bolted to walls, their iron still cold to the touch, wooden tables stained dark from repeated use, cots with leather straps affixed at the corners. On one shelf, rows of glass jars containing strange residues, their labels faded but still legible. Tincture of digitalis, laudanum, oil of bitter almond. The rescuers staggered at the sight, their lantern light flickering over implements that belonged not to a home for children, but to a place of calculated restraint. The most horrifying discovery was the bodies, some still shackled where they had fallen when smoke poured into the hidden rooms, others arranged in grotesque neatness, stacked in careful rows as though catalogued for study. Their small forms were skeletal, their remnants marked by rusted iron rings. The air was thick with the stench of ash and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Even the strongest men dropped their tools, crossing themselves in disbelief. Amid the debris, 3 leather-bound journals were recovered. Their covers were scorched but intact, their pages filled with the same precise handwriting that reduced children to numbered entries. Each page contained measurements, pulse counts, durations of silence, notes on deprivation and collapse. One line recorded, "Subject number 27 expired at 2:41 a.m. after forced wakefulness. Duration of terminal seizure, 6 minutes, 14 seconds. Another noted, "Subject number 31 displayed resistance at first. Subdued after 17 minutes. Expired after 3 days without water. Musculature observed atrophy." The entries blurred scripture with data, quoting verses alongside timings as if sanctifying cruelty with holy words. Those who read the journals by lantern light realized that the deaths had not been random misfortunes of illness. They had been orchestrated, measured, and recorded with deliberate intent. The asylum had been a laboratory, and the children, subjects of experiment. Outside, the townsfolk who had come to save lives found themselves facing an impossible reality. Mothers fell to their knees in the dirt, clutching rosaries, unable to reconcile faith with the horrors beneath the cross-topped roof. Fathers shouted for justice, their voices breaking against the night sky. The sheriff, pale and trembling, admitted aloud what none had dared to say before, that the Asylum of Mercy was never a sanctuary. The blaze consumed the upper floors by dawn, but it was what the fire revealed in the basement that seared itself into history. The community could no longer look away. The mask of sanctity had burned away, and in its place stood evidence too grim to deny. The climax had arrived not as salvation, but as revelation. By dawn, the flames had guttered to dull glow, and the rescue line turned into a reckoning. Names were called against dormitory rolls. Inked numbers refused to align with the handful of ash-streaked children trembling in the yard. The sheriff posted men at the doors, but there was little left to guard. The most dangerous things in the building had never been the iron or the brick. They were the pages. 3 journals and 2 account books were carried to the courthouse beneath smoke-scented blankets. A physician, a schoolmaster, and the clerk of court set about copying before soot could smudge the ink. Transcribing with the brittle calm of men who understood evidence has a way of disappearing when important people arrive. The journals were largely in one hand upright, disciplined, unhurried, interrupted by a second hand that corrected figures, underlined phrases, and wrote single words in the margin that felt like commands. Stillness, compliance, quiet. The entries read like inward-facing liturgies. Subject no. 12. Hours of stillness extended to 18. Respiration reduced from 24 per minute to 10. Compliant. No. 19. Resistance at hour 7. Correction applied. Termination at 3:17 a.m. Convulsion duration 42 seconds. Verses from Corinthians and Hebrews clung to the edges, lending benediction to pulse counts and deprivation schedules. Some pages carried faint press marks, as if they had been weighted beneath stone the way flowers are dried. The effect was the same. Life flattened into a specimen. The account books finished the sentence the journals had begun. Early leaves balanced flour, coal, wool blankets. Mid-year columns shifted vocabulary, chain by the yard, padlocks by the dozen, matched pairs of iron rings, laudanum and digitalis in quantities fit for a hospital, lime in bulk. Receipts bore Father Muldoon's seal. A smaller ledger, kept with the same tidy hand, tracked visits and collections, noting which sermon themes opened purses, which benefactors preferred schoolroom tours, which hours produced tears. Piety and profit were reconciled in adjacent columns. When riders were sent to find Sister Constance and Father Muldoon, the trail was already a day old. A light wagon had left the stable before the alarm, heading west along the river road. Harnesses were packed for distance. A locked chest was lifted with care to the wagon bed. No formal pursuit followed. The deputy still hauled buckets at the fire line, and the sheriff stood in the opened corridor below, staring at iron set into stone as if the building itself were answering questions he had not dared to ask. By evening, a diocesan courier reached the courthouse with an urgent letter requesting custody of all material relating to pastoral work for canonical review. The clerk resisted and lost. The journals went into a crate labeled as correspondence and sealed with wax. In the last hour before the crate was carried out, the physician copied what he could seize 12 pages folded to a palm's size beneath his coat. He would spend the rest of his life wishing he had stolen more. Grief hardened into action. Mothers sifted the ash for buttons and lockets. Fathers turned stones as if each might conceal a hinge to one more door. Anger followed, blunt and unfocused, directed at fence rails, at the bell at the cross. Then came a discipline different from the one the asylum had practiced, a decision to name what had happened and to keep it from burial. During the clearing of the chapel, a plank softened by heat gave way, revealing a recess under the floor. Inside lay small belongings sorted with museum care lockets, hair ribbons, tin tags stamped with numbers, each wrapped in paper, labeled only with dates. They were trophies and inventory both. The sheriff compiled an affidavit that braided testimony to physical record. Rings bolted into stone, cots fitted with leather restraints, glass jars labeled with sedatives and poisons, ledgers whose dates of purchase synced with dates of death. letters to families addressed and stamped, then stacked unsent in a crate. He dispatched copies to the county judge and the governor's secretary. Months later, a reply would acknowledge receipt and warn that further publication might excite the public unnecessarily. In the meantime, state officers arrived, inventoried ruins with professional indifference, and removed what remained to storage, where labels read "restricted" instead of evidence. The surviving sisters were dispersed to distant convent houses. Their statements were uniform: sorrow, obedience, silence. No charges were filed. The law, seeking a single defendant, found only an institution arranged to dissolve culpability into procedure. In the absence of arrests, responsibility settled like ash on those who preferred sanctity to scrutiny: donors who never asked to see the basement, officials who deferred to vestments, congregants who mistook the absence of noise for the presence of virtue. Within a week, the asylum was reduced to salvage. Brick became riverbank fill. Lime and charcoal turned the garden soil where nothing grew for seasons. The cellar rings were cut flush with the flags, so a plow could pass without catching, as if the field had never held a building. Only the physician's copies, the schoolmaster's transcripts, and a few family letters preserved the outline of what the fire had revealed. Read together, they show a method that does not need confession, a theology repurposed as protocol, a schedule disguised as care, an arithmetic that begins with names and ends with numbers. Climax is supposed to deliver justice. Here it delivered a different conclusion: departure, silence, and crates borne away under seals. Yet revelation altered the town's grammar. From that day forward, sanctity was no longer accepted as evidence. Locks were counted, basements toured, donations entered in ledgers with eyes open, and in kitchens and at gravesides the names that never appeared in the journals were spoken aloud, so the numbers that replaced them would not be the last marks left of their lives. When the smoke cleared and the records were hastily copied, what remained was not justice but aftermath. The Orphan Asylum of Mercy stood as a ruin. Its upper floors collapsed into blackened beams, while its basement, the true chamber of horrors, remained intact enough to tell a story no one wanted to hear. The town of Lawrence staggered beneath the revelations. Families who had entrusted children to the asylum demanded answers that would never fully come. Mothers combed through ash and stone, searching for keepsakes: a button, a ribbon, a locket that might testify that their child had once lived. Fathers dug shallow pits by lantern light, reburying fragments as though piecing together dignity from bones. Yet the scale of the loss could not be measured in bodies alone. It was measured in silence, the silence of children who never returned, the silence of official reports that used the word illness long after the evidence showed otherwise, the silence of church authorities who reclaimed the journals only to hide them away. The wider community wrestled with questions that had no comfortable answers. How could piety conceal such cruelty? How could entire towns have stood so close to atrocity and failed to see it? The few who spoke openly suggested that it was not blindness, but willful refusal. The asylum had been convenient a place to place orphans, the sick, the unwanted. As long as its doors remained closed and the chapel hymn rang on Sundays, people were content to accept its image. When truth came, it showed them not only the depravity of the sisters and their priest, but the cowardice of neighbors who chose not to ask. The surviving children, those few pulled alive from the upper dormitory, never returned to normal life. Dr. Harding attempted to follow their cases for several years. His journals describe blank stares, nervous tremors, and recurring night terrors that made sleep impossible. One boy, scarcely 10, could not endure silence. He filled rooms with ceaseless humming, terrified of quiet. Another grew violently ill whenever she heard church bells. Harding, groping for an explanation, wrote that the children had been conditioned, trained to obey, to suffer, to expect pain in ritual form. His words conditioned silence, ritualized suffering sound modern, clinical, but they also testify to wounds that never healed. As for Constance and Father Muldoon, the records fracture. Some claimed they were sighted in St. Louis, cloaked and hurried, seeking passage farther west. Others insisted they were sheltered by distant branches of the church, hidden in monasteries or convents where inquiries would not penetrate. None of these reports were ever confirmed. What remained were the sealed crates of journals and ledgers, spirited away under clerical seals, later filed under restricted. In effect, the asylum's leaders vanished as completely as the children they had claimed to protect. The state convened a brief inquiry, but its conclusions were evasive. The official report listed deaths due to consumption, wasting fever, and accidental injury, noting that superstition has exaggerated the matter. Only Harding's private testimony, circulated in manuscript among medical colleagues, preserved the darker truth. His writings, like those of Dr. Harrison on the triplets in Ohio, or Dr. Miller on Emma Richter's terrifying predictions, formed part of an underground canon, cases where 19th-century medicine glimpsed horrors it could not classify and therefore suppressed. In the decades that followed, memory of the asylum hardened into folklore. Locals avoided the hilltop, claiming lights flickered where no walls remained. Children dared each other to leave pebbles on the foundation stones, only to find them rearranged in strange patterns the next day. Preachers warned against speaking the names of Constance or Muldoon, while older residents muttered that the ruin was cursed ground. By the early 20th century, only foundation stones and cellar hollows remained, yet the stories endured. Modern investigators digging through archived ledgers in the 1970s confirmed what survivors had whispered: expenditures for chains and iron rings, shipments of lime, bulk orders of arsenic disguised as pest remedy. These mundane receipts, cross-checked with Harding's copies, revealed the systematic nature of the crimes. Just as the Graysons of Oregon kept meticulous ledgers of murder disguised as ministry, so too did the asylum's keepers turn horror into record-keeping, as if paperwork could sanctify atrocity. The consequences ripple forward even now. Psychologists cite the Asylum of Mercy in papers on early institutional abuse, noting how the mix of religious authority, isolation, and absolute control over children produced conditions indistinguishable from experiments. Historians of medicine note its eerie parallels to later studies in conditioning, silence, and sensory deprivation. Geneticists even tested remains uncovered in the 1990s, searching for traces of disease, but found instead evidence of toxins consistent with arsenic exposure. What resolution, then, can be spoken of? Justice was never served in court. The guilty fled. The survivors bore scars for life. The community tried to bury its complicity beneath silence. Yet the story survives in whispered folklore, in Harding's journals, in the yellowed copies made by a schoolmaster's hand before the church sealed its crates. That survival is its own consequence. The truth refused burial, and so the ruin of the asylum stands not merely as a burned shell on a Kansas hill, but as a parable, a reminder that evil can flourish beneath hymns, that ledgers can hide atrocity as easily as they record it, and that silence, the silence of children trained not to cry, the silence of communities unwilling to ask, can be deadlier than fire. The consequence is memory itself, a history too terrible to forget, too late to change, forever etched into the hidden annals of America's darkest century. The Orphan Asylum of Mercy is gone, its walls torn down, its stones scattered, its records locked away. Yet what it left behind remains heavier than brick or iron. It left a question that cannot be silenced. How could such horrors thrive in plain sight, protected by prayers and trusted by an entire community? Was it blindness, fear, or the comfort of believing that suffering behind closed doors could never touch one's own family? These are not questions confined to 19th century Kansas. They echo wherever faith or authority is accepted, without scrutiny wherever silence is mistaken for peace. So now I turn to you. Do you believe stories like this could still be hidden in our own time, buried beneath respectability until fire or chance forces them into view? Share your thoughts in the comments, because memory grows stronger when it is spoken, and forgetting is the ally of cruelty. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and share this story so that the children whose names were erased are not erased again. And join me next time when we uncover another hidden chapter of America's macabre history, another tale that asks what people will allow themselves not to see. Until then, remember, the most frightening shadows are cast not by darkness, but by the light we choose to trust too easily.